So, hello, I am Julius Colwyn, and in some senses I'm an artist, but actually I've never really agreed with the term because it's a little bit inaccurate, because in various different aspects of my life and work I also act as a curator and a collaborator, I act as a researcher and analyst, and I work with a very wide array of people. So in that sense, for me, the question that drives me has never really been about the artwork, the individual object or performance or installation or what have you. It's been about the work of art. What is it that it does? And what is it that culture does? If culture is what happens when you add all of these artists in their respective mediums together, what is it that culture is for? What's its purpose? So initially what drove me to this question was in my own interest, really. As a practitioner, I wanted to figure out what on earth it was I was doing. But then as I started to find answers, I found that they applied in a much broader context. To society as a whole, and that's kind of what I'd like to share with you today. In order to start that story, I'm going to start with why I learned and how I came about to do what I do. So I started my education in Edinburgh University, and I ended up doing the history of art and English literature as this kind of joint degree. But they let me roam between departments, and I was allowed to get into the anthropology department and study politics and philosophy and anthropology as well. And in the end, I was trying to find the common denominator between all of these things, and what I discovered is that it was meaning. I actually learned how human beings write down political positions and how you can dance the shape of a state of mind, how you can sculpt a concept or capture a social force in spoken word. So there were all of these meanings and all of their different medium, the ways in which they moved. And so from this perspective, having learned all this history and theory of meaning, I then went to its practice, and so what sort of formulated my practice as a practitioner, I suppose is the best term, was a course that I did at St Martin's, which was the MA Art and Science. And this really challenged my notions of creative practice, because the course is comprised not just of artists, but of engineers, scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, you name it. There's someone on there who has that body of knowledge at their disposal, and everyone's interrogating each other, using different methodologies and approaches, trying to figure out how you make knowledge or information. And so from this platform, this amazing platform, I ended up collaborating with scientists in lots of different disciplines. But most recently, I've been working with scientists who work in complex systems theory. And particularly, I've been privileged to work with Eve Middleton-Kelly, who's the director and founder of the Complexity Research Group at LSE. And I've also been working with the AKC Global Group, who are this international consultancy who apply, amongst other things, complex systems to international development. And so there's all this information that's coming at me from these people, and it's fascinating information. But in a weird way, that's not what's important to me right now, because the information, although it is fascinating, is highly technical, and in order to explain it, it would use a lot of technical terminology and jargon, and to be honest, that's not going to travel. What's important to me here is the meaning of it, because complexity means something for human beings and human society, and for culture within that society. And it means something rather beautiful. So here, I think it's important to differentiate between information and meaning with the help of these lovely diagrams. So we exist in reality. This is the situation we find ourselves in, and it's a very complicated, vibrant phenomenon. It's constantly in flux. And what we do in order to understand reality is we take data from it. So we abstract a particular part of reality and we remove it from its context in order to study it and understand it. And then, when we've got lots of different pieces of data, when you put them together in such a way that they make sense, they give us information. So an example might be we would collect data, ice core samples from Antarctica, and they will give us, in their combination, all of these ice core samples, they'll give us information about the changing levels of carbon in the atmosphere over the course of a very long period of history. That's the information. So what does it mean? I mean, within the context of human society, for me, this is what meaning is. It's information within human experience. What those ice cores mean might be systemic shock. They might be anxiety or fear for the future. They might mean to you not being able to see how your children's world is going to look like. So what I'm about is meaning, how things mean. And I want to talk about complexity and look at society, human society, as a complex system, and the role of culture within that system. So I'm going to do that using metaphor. And I'm going to use this in a technical sense rather than just oh, that's an artist who uses metaphor. Because there's a lot of artistic use of metaphor, such as Juliet is the sun. And all of a sudden you know that she is bright, that she is warm, that she is nourishing. And that maybe if you don't wear sunscreen, she might burn you. But it's also used in the sciences. If we take all the models in science that we rely on in order to interpret and make our decisions about reality, they are in a sense a metaphor, in that they take something of reality or disparate parts of reality, and they put it together in such a way that it's a reduced model, it's an abstraction. So the understanding of metaphor I'm working with is from the theory of embodied cognition, which was discovered by these guys, which is Lakoff and Johnson, and they're in a field called cognitive linguistics. And so how we're going to use metaphor to look at society. You're in a dark room, and there's something in the middle, and it's shadowy and liquid and profound, and you can't quite see what it is. And so you throw a light on it. But it only catches one element. You can see a few facets, a few of its curves. You know something more about it, but the other side of it is still hidden. And so metaphor in this way, this is what Lakoff and Johnson call highlighting and hiding, which is that when we use a metaphor or a model to describe something in reality that's complicated, it only tells some parts of it. In order to get the whole picture, you have to strike that from multiple different angles. So I'm going to use 3 metaphors to talk about society, and hopefully by the end we'll get a sense of what it means for society to be this complex system. This is a quick definition that I think is really important, because the word complexity, unfortunately, and the whole discipline has struggled with this, is laboured with an association. There is a profound difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex, as evidenced by the opposites, their antonyms. So the opposite of complicated is something that is simple. The opposite of something that is complex is something that is independent. A complex thing is dependent, is defined by its context, the things around it, the things that interact with it. And we'll go into that a little bit more, but a weather system is a beautiful example to kick off with. If we think about you here in this room breathing in and out, and as you do so, you are changing the temperature of the air as it leaves your body. That will build up a huge amount of hotter air in this room. It's already hot to begin with. But when the doors open, the pressure differential will change. Eventually, if you take all of the breath and business that human beings do in a city like London, it ends up contributing to the change in weather patterns. And there are multiple different factors that are affected here, but the point is that it's all hooked up. You can't separate one part from the other. So something complex is something that is defined by its context, that is its context. So I've looked at society and complexity before. This is a work that I made in response to my work with LSE and with AKC. And it looks at human society using metaphor. And the overall metaphor is one of flow, the fact that we're caught between all of these different processes. And it looks at it on an individual, at a communal, and a global scale. The metaphors I've used here are looking at society in general. And those 3 different sculptures, we're looking at flow, structure, and connectivity. But actually, if we're going to look at culture and the role of culture in society, I'm going to use some different metaphors. And that's what we're going to go through now. So the first one, this is a very old metaphor that you'll all be familiar with. Society as a body, the body politic. If we consider what we know of the body, or the way we would think about the body, as a single entity, it's tricky to get around this idea that it's one thing, because we think of ourselves as one thing, I, but actually it's comprised of many different things, and it's a kind of a babushka doll of component parts that mutually inform one another. So if you start on the very smallest scale, and for this it does get smaller, it always gets smaller, it could go to molecular levels or atomic levels or what have you, but we'll start with cells. All of those different cells have different kinds of function. The way that they interact in particular configurations or structures leads to things that we call tissues, particular configurations of cells. When you get those tissues, the way that certain tissues interact and interface with one another, you get organs, particular functional collections of tissues. But actually the way that all of those organs interact ends up being systems. So say, for example, the respiratory system or the digestive system. But in a sense, all of their collaborative effort, each one impacting the other, makes the body. Any one of those systems, organs, tissues, or even cells goes awry, and there's a cascade through the system. the causal impacts ricochet and expand out beyond any one thing. It cannot be reduced. So if we think about society in this sense, if we think of the individual as the cell, and the tissue as an organisation, and an organ as an industry, and then a system as the way that an industry fits within society, and then the body as an even broader sense, a global society. We are structured in a similar fashion. And actually, in a way, we kind of like cells, we divide and separate, assign and identify. So this is the metaphor of society as a body. But as we said earlier on, a metaphor both highlights and hides certain phenomena. So whilst the metaphor of society as the body tells us about its internal structure, the way that all of its insides codepend, what it kind of leaves out, because of the nature of the body, is the way that it interacts with the outside, because we tend to think of the body as separate. So in order to talk about those relations with context, I'm going to use society as an ecology. Now, ecology is the study of different entities within a system according to their relations to each other. And actually, if we start with a super simple idea of a bee and a flower, and here that's the yellow one and the green one, we consider them separate entities in a way, because they have separate bodies. In time and space, they seem separate. But actually, if we look at how they've evolved over millions, if not billions of years, and the way that they have co-evolved, so that they require one another, they define each other, then actually you can kind of draw a circle around them and say that's the system. One thing, not two. And actually, if you think out a little bit further and you think actually something eats the fruit that is germinated by that pollination process in that plant, and you can draw a circle around that, and something eats the honey, and you draw a circle around that, actually you can draw a circle around all of that and say that's the system. If you keep going out in this way, with this interrelation of context, of individuals and what is around them as being co-defining, then you end up with complexity, effectively, but this ecological sense. And so again, to the highlighting and hiding, ecology tells us all about this connectivity between different parts and the context dependence of them. But what it doesn't highlight quite so well, what it perhaps hides, is the free will, the agency of each of those entities or creatures. And for us as human beings, so concerned with our own agency and free will, we need another metaphor to look at that aspect of society and how it works. So society is a swarm, but hold up, because swarms actually have got a bit of a negative association. We tend to associate them with insects and therefore get a kind of creepy, crawly feeling. But actually, as a principle, it can be very beautiful. So I've chosen a murmuration of starlings, which is one of the most gorgeous things that exists, I think. But basically, a complex adaptive system, which is the complexity term for something like a swarm, is a system comprised of many individual agents. Each of these birds moving and changing here is a unique autonomous individual. There is no central brain. There is no top-down directive as to how they act. They are each making all of the decisions in real time in response to their environment. One bird might sense the change in a thermal updraft or see an insect that they want to go to, and the rest of the swarm or the flock, with starlings it's called a murmuration, will move to follow it. They move with a peculiar set of principles. In complexity science, they've modelled the flocking behaviour of birds down to three core principles, one of which is separation, which is basically don't get too close to your neighbours, which is a kind of a short-range repulsion. The other is alignment, which is you head in the average direction of your neighbours. And the other is cohesion, which is you head to the average position of your neighbours. So these three principles, actually, if you program them in, deliver you this kind of behaviour quite accurately. But then, if we think about this as a metaphor for society, we have a sign of different situation in which we do move collectively, but it's slightly more complex. I mean, we're human beings, we're not birds, it's not just about insects and updrafts. We have other motivations that drive us, and they can be very complicated and very tangled. But the principles, in a peculiar way, still apply. So how does culture fit into this? Culture is, in a way, it's the guiding force. It's the principle that's directing where these creatures move to. This is actually a comic book convention. It's what's driven them all there into those peculiar configurations and the way that they sit into all of those lines. If we go back to the ecology metaphor and we think about what culture does within an ecology, we can think of it in terms of fungi. I found is actually a very useful way of thinking of it. They form part of the nutrition cycle, which is they decompose inert entities or entities that are no longer functioning but full of valuable material. Say, for example, an idea or a body of information that on its own can't make any social change. It can't gain any traction. But then culture gets to work and it begins to break it down into its various components so that they can be spread out to the entire ecosystem, that other things can absorb those qualities and employ them in their own function. And if we go back to the body metaphor, and then we look at the role of culture in that body metaphor, then we can consider us as a kind of metabolism in a similar way, in that there are certain things that come into our body that we can ingest something, but not fully digest it. It breaks down component parts and allows society as a whole to absorb and be able to use, to nourish itself on information that might otherwise remain inert. So, the work of art, culture in a complex system, for me, as an individual practitioner or artist, the work of art is a process of making sense. It's a way of achieving comprehension through execution. But if we add all those artists together in all their different fields, and we call that culture, what's the work of culture? I think it is a similar one, in that it is a way of society making sense of itself, of what is happening to it, a way of processing information. And actually, when we are faced, as we often are, and particularly now, with times of trauma or stress or uncertainty, I think then more than ever is the time for culture and for the work of culture to really get working, because it will help society determine, like that murmuration of starlings, its collective principles of action. What move us to do something, to change our behaviour, to make a difference in a particular area. And if we look at the other metaphors, say for example ecology, the work of art, it's about being part of things, and it's also about processing things so that as a collective, as a society, as a species, we have a mechanism for understanding what's happening to us and for making decisions and moving forward. Thank you.